Well, good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be here, and what an amazing venue. So thank you so much again to the City of London for letting us use this space tonight and for their support. For those who don't know me, I'm the Associate Director for Sustainable Finance at E3G. I'm also the co-head of the TPT Secretariat alongside Ben Caldecott from the Centre of Greening Finance and Investment, who you'll hear from a little later before we close for drinks. So I'm extremely proud to have been part of the progress of the TPT in the last year, and the announcements made by Amanda Blanc and the Baroness Penn show that there's so much work still to come in the year ahead. So the private sector is at a pivot point in terms of having climate leadership actions made on a voluntary basis begin to shape mainstream norms and in due course become part of regulatory expectations. And it's extraordinary to reflect on how far things have moved in this direction in the course of only a few years. I know many people in the room today have been part of that journey. Transition plans are currently at the cutting edge of this shift. So businesses across the economy are making their response to climate change integral to their overall organisational strategy. There's so much momentum across the economy in terms of moving from pledges to plans and implementation. So tonight we have 4 members of the TPT steering group with us to share their own unique perspectives on transition plans, why it's so important for their work and what their learnings have been to date. So I'll just briefly introduce them and then we'll pass over to hear from them. But to let you know who's on our panel, Sarah Breeden is the Executive Director for Financial Stability at the Bank of England. Sarah leads the Bank of England's work on climate change domestically and internationally. And as well as being an observer of the TPT steering group, Sarah is a steering group member of the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS. Graeme Pitkethly has been the Chief Financial Officer at Unilever since 2015 and previously held roles in telecommunications and corporate finance. He's also the Vice Chair of the TCFD and a member of the Advisory Board of Strathclyde University's Centre for Sustainable Development. Tanya Steele is the CEO of WWF UK, a role that she's held since 2017. Tanya previously worked in executive roles at Save the Children and in the tech industry. And last but not least, Sacha Sadan is the Director of ESG at the FCA, which is a newly created role to embed ESG across the wide spectrum of regulatory activities. And Sacha was previously Director of Investment Stewardship at LGIM. So we've got a range of different perspectives. I'm sure we'll have a very rich set of contributions. I'm going to start with asking Sarah, as Executive Director for Financial Stability at the Bank of England, at a macro level, transition plans are key to understanding how we're responding to the need for transition at a systemic level. Now, the TPT has proposed that companies take a strategic and rounded approach to ensure that their strategy delivers real-world decarbonisation impacts. Can you explain why that's a key component from a financial stability perspective?
Look, it's absolutely essential, Kate. We all know, and the Bank of England's climate scenario exercise that we conducted and published in May last year, that exercise underlined that a world with climate change is riskier than one without, and that the costs and risks are minimised with an early and orderly transition. Now, giving effect to that transition means reducing greenhouse emissions in the real economy, with the financial sector allocating capital to fund that transition. And that means 2 things. It means investing in the currently green, those firms that already have low emissions, but it's also about greening our future economy, providing capital to those firms that currently have high emissions, but need to reduce them if we are to reach our collective goal of net zero. It does not mean decarbonisation on paper, reducing only the direct transition risk that financial firms face, chasing emissions into the shadows, depriving those that need to reduce their emissions access to the finance to do so isn't good for the planet, and it isn't good for financial stability either. And that is why transition plans are so important. Transition plans show how financial and non-financial firms are taking that strategic and rounded approach to their transition strategies, to their engagement with counterparties and with suppliers, to ensure that the firms are not just mitigating and managing risk to themselves as part of their strategy, but they're identifying opportunities for sustainable growth and investment to support the wider economy transition that we need to see. So transition plans, to me, show that while we're financing the currently dirty, we're not dithering in what is a decisive decade. A pledge becomes a plan, and it's a plan that's driving the right outcomes of real-world decarbonisation and of protecting financial stability. They honestly could not be more important.
Right, well, thank you very much. Graeme, as Chief Financial Officer at Unilever, you were involved in preparing your own transition plan in 2020, and Unilever, of course, is long-standing leader on climate action. What was the key enabler for Unilever in ensuring that it reflected the organisation's strategy whilst managing climate risks?
In all honesty, Kate, I think one of the things is that we started really early. I had a little chuckle when Amanda said, just give it a go. That was pretty much the spirit with which we approached it in 2020, and we took our first transition plan. We call it the CTAP, the Climate Transition Action Plan. We took it to our AGM actually in 2021. It was voted then. We report on it in the annual report and accounts. And I think we're back in 2024. We treat it a bit like the Director's Remuneration Report and come back on a 3-yearly basis. So I think the first thing was that we started early because there's a lot of work involved in putting a quality transition plan together. I think the second thing, looking back on it, is that we had a highly integrated sustainable business strategy. If you go back to I'm old enough, alongside Sash, to be honest, of remembering things like, integrated reporting, the integrated reporting agenda, trying to bring everything into one consolidated set of reports. But, to really do this well, you have to integrate your sustainable business strategy into your financial strategy for value creation. And we worked very hard at that. And then the final thing is I think we've got a high degree of business engagement behind it, and we have worked to try and prioritize quite rigorously. If you look actually at our business strategy, there's a front page and a back page to it. The back page to it has got a lot of sustainability commitments. There's 9 pillars, and I think at last count, 34 detailed goals around it. That's a lot, and that's a lot for a business to, even leaders in the business, to engage in. So what we've done is we've prioritized 4 of those goals as sort of first among equals, and we've brought that onto the front page of our business strategy and our value creation plan. And they're broadly around climate, they're around plastics, important for a consumer company. They're around regenerative agriculture, and they're around sort of living standards within our extended value chain. So the prioritization has been very, very important as well. But all of that, again, to the comments that Amanda made, it's not easy. You've got to get started. You've got to not be fearful of it. You've got to be prepared to iterate around it and improve. And you sort of have to park that habit that we all have of never ever, and again, Sacha remembers this when he used to cover Unilever, but there's this sort of, aim low and beat the number thing, and that sort of doesn't apply in situations like this where you have to be prepared to take some risk and maybe fail a little bit and then iterate around the plan.
Thank you. Just in case anyone here is not getting the key messages, I think very much we're hearing, get on with it, don't worry too much about it being perfect. So I hope everyone's taking that away so far. Tanya, when I introduced you, one thing I didn't mention is that you recently were awarded a CBE, so congratulations for that. That's hugely deserved for your leadership in driving the nature agenda, which has been gaining huge momentum over the last few years. So as CEO of WWF, you've been at the forefront of increasing wider understanding that we can't tackle climate change without halting the lack of nature, or the loss of nature, sorry, and indeed restoring nature. And WWF recently published a paper on nature in transition plans. So for companies who are yet to get started on that area, what are your key recommendations?
Well, thank you. And as ever is I'm a great believer in the get on with it in terms of, and learn fast. I guess I'd say probably 3 quick things. First of all, I do think it's important to actually acknowledge nature and its role from a climate perspective. And that's not just in terms of evening and weekend pursuits. And the number of NEDs or boards I sit down with, and there's this sense of, please, Tanya, just leave me alone. We just want to deal with climate right now. We'll get to nature in a few years' time, but we just don't want to deal with it right now. But the reality is climate and nature or biodiversity, they're two sides of the same coin. And ultimately, we know if the science tells us that if we have any hope of reaching a 1.5 degree world, that we have to ensure that the carbon sinks that we have actually keep standing and keep doing the job that they're doing. But also, increasingly, we need nature to be in a position to do an even better job to absorb all the excess greenhouse gases that we have. And there is no credible IPCC trajectory that does not assume that there will be more nature on the planet than we have right now. So ultimately, this is going to be at the heart in terms of what we need to do with our whole economy approaches. And indeed, obviously, that's critical from very much a business perspective as well. There's also, of course, the small point that we know that ultimately a healthy natural environment is the very foundation of our global economy. I know it's very hard to imagine in the City of London with all the concrete and the stone walls, but ultimately we do know that, you know, there's an additional benefit in terms of securing business and growth for the future. I guess the second area, which is a little bit more practical, is in terms of really focusing on impact. And ultimately, when we think about this, and we've certainly discussed this from a transition plan perspective, some of the biggest areas of impact of potential nature loss sit around deforestation and conversion of land, because ultimately then, you know, nature cannot do the job that we very much need it to do at this point in time. And I would really invite businesses to start to dig into your supply chains, really start to have a look at that. Many did through the pandemic, but as you start to lift the lid, certainly across a series of high-risk commodities, whether it's paper, pulp, cattle, soy, palm oil and beyond, and actually you can start to see many of those impacts starting to emerge as well. But indeed go into other supply chain settings, whether you're a huge investor in terms of electrical vehicles, actually where are those minerals being mined from? Is it from the Western Congo Basin, one of the most important standing forests on the planet? So it's actually just reaching in and trying to understand, are there unintended consequences, or actually can this be done in a way that's benefiting climate, but also benefiting nature as that sort of two sides of the same coin type approach. And then I guess the third area is very much an invitation in terms of go further. You know, you'd kind of expect me to say that in terms of do go just that little bit further. Is there the opportunity to be not just net zero, but nature net positive? And, you know, anyone that attends the World Economic Forum, reads those many reports, there is unquestionably an opportunity around the transition into a nature net positive scenario. And I know some of those estimates sit at around about 10 trillion by the end of 2030 and an additional 395 million jobs to come from that. Because it comes not from, you know, ethereal thinking. Ultimately, if you start to look at your business, if you're considering the wider nature impacts, actually you're very often looking at some of the costs, some of the risks, and sometimes the things that you may not need as part of your supply chain overall. So it can be sort of, you know, net benefit in terms of benefiting from that transition. And I guess the final thing is we know that many of the financial institutions, there are certainly even funds being launched to try and encourage businesses to start this nature net positive transition. And certainly as organisations, as well as your brilliant plans, you could look to benefit from that investment too.
Great, thank you very much. And Sacha, as ESG Director at the FCA, you've been a key driver of the UK's agenda on transition plan disclosure. So why is the FCA focused on transition plans, and what advice would you give to the firms preparing them?
Hi everyone. So someone who's been an investor and an owner for a long time, climate change is obviously so important, that's why you're here. But we've had this debate many times with things like employees or diversity. And in the past, we've had many companies say to us, and people said, I have a policy on diversity, or I have a policy on employees. And then you go into the detail of what's your retention rate, what's your churn rate, how much money do you spend on training, and then you suddenly get flummoxed. And I think with net zero, the point that we were trying to work out was everyone and their dog was selling their signing up to another signatory. That was nice. That was great, and it was a really good start, and it's very good because then you can hold them. But what's more important is practical stuff, and we've already talked about some of that. So where does the regulator come in? The regulator's going, well, first of all, we're co-leading the sandbox to make sure that you have safe harbour so that you can have a go. say-do attitude, and the regulator will be there holding your hand, which you don't hear that very often, do you? But that's really important in this area. Secondly, it is difficult, so we know that. But therefore, let's make it comparable. And the one thing that we found as a financial regulator, it shouldn't always be those same pesky sectors that everyone knows, that everyone talks about, whether it's oil and gas, cement, mining. This is about all of us. And therefore, it has to be like that. And therefore, as a financial regulator who cares about the consumer, we wanted to make sure that we do our bit and also help on that. So I think that's important. Thirdly, the debate we get, just like government gets sometimes, can you make it consistent? Can you make it comparable? We are trying so hard to make it with ISSB, as you all know. Secondly, I'm literally going around talking to many international regulators, and I've been very fortunate to be one of the co-chairs of the International Securities Regulator, and they want to know about our transition plans, and we want to give them that so that the Unilevers and Avivas go round and they have the same plan, so it's comparable. And not just equities, I know we do that, and I'm really, really important. Private equity, everywhere else. So this is consistent. And then it's up to you. It's not up to the regulator to work out whether that plan is good or bad. It will be investors, the owners of capital, to decide. But when we find out, you got a very positive vote at your AGM, and I remember at Legal & General we voted for it. But if you didn't get a positive vote, then the regulator might be interested to find out why you didn't get a positive vote, and that's how we can use our influence. But they are the ways that we want that. Consistency, comparability, but thanks for signing something. Show me your plan, and then I can work out whether that plan is comparable in your sector. And it's not just for the traditional sectors, because in the end of the day, even media companies can make a massive difference with their influence, and that's something we talk about. But say and do something, and you will get the regulator trying to help you.
Can I add something on that? Because I think Sacha raises a great point about the international interest that there is in this initiative. I was on a call with my peers from the Network for the Greening of the Financial System. Huge interest in what we are doing on transition plans here. Real desire to see how this can drive the right behaviours. So another encouragement to roll your sleeves up and have a go, because we can show how to do it practically, pragmatically, and export it on the back of that.
So you've actually read my mind, because we are blessed tonight with a panel that are all expert and efficient communicators, which means we just about have time to squeeze another round of questions in. And the one I was going to come back to you on was, now that Sacha's talked about why the FCA as a regulator is focusing on transition plans, it would be interesting to hear your perspective as a regulator with the PRA, and also to hear a bit more about that international work.
So climate change is a risk that we see looking forwards, not looking backwards. And as a central bank, as a regulator, what I'm trying to do is understand how different transition pathways are going to impact the economy, financial stability, and safety and soundness of individual firms. Now, looking forwards requires us to build a transition finance infrastructure. That's forward-looking disclosures, forward-looking labels, forward-looking transition plans, both for financial firms and for firms in the real economy. And that forward-looking information can help us understand whether capital is being allocated to the transition or not, and moving from a static description of where we are to a strategic analysis of where we are going is absolutely fundamental if I am to understand whether we are reducing risks to financial stability. So for me, I am an avid supporter of transition plans. But I'm also a user of them as well. If I want to understand how well are we doing delivering our objectives in supporting the transition, we will be a great customer of the documents that you guys put together. We have a firm view, one plan, many users, not multiple overlapping obligations, and that is the attitude that we're taking into our international debate as well. As I said before, these plans could not be more fundamental in helping us understand whether we're doing a good job of driving that transition.
Great, thank you. And is there anything else you'd like to add around international discussions on transition plans?
It's a live debate. It's a live debate in the G20, in the FSB, in the Network for the Greening of the Financial System, in IOSCO. The eyes are upon us. We are leading the world here. Let's show them how to do it well.
And what they like best is we're trying to use ISSB standards. We're trying to use TCFD that's there. We're not suddenly coming out with a brand new template. That's really important. It's a standard, it's there, it's consistent, and it can be used. And one thing we've got to say is it's up to the owners of capital to get people to do this, not just in equities and not just Graeme and Amanda and PLCs. It's really important.
Great, thank you. So Graeme, I've got a different kind of question for you. So credible approaches to tackling climate change are becoming crucial for companies to attract top talent. A recent KPMG study showed that a third of graduates are assessing the ESG credentials of their prospective employers. So is delivering against your transition plan a recruitment and retention tool as well as a business strategy?
I think, Kate, the answer to that is sort of, because I think that it is how you communicate the type of company you are across a broad suite of your business objectives and your sustainability objectives and how integrated you are around that. I think that's ultimately what your current employees and your future employees and many, many other stakeholders are interested in. Now, I do think that having a credible, focused transition plan that you are delivering against adds a huge amount of credibility to that. So it's a credibility point, but I'm not sure you could rock up on LinkedIn or in the various recruitment rounds that everybody does and say, here's my transition plan. I think it's broader than that, but it definitely adds a lot of credibility to it. Certainly in our experience, I mean, we are blessed with a tremendous pool of talent, and within our sector, we're the #1 employer of choice in 16 of our top 20 markets. And I do put a lot of that down to, Unilever's strategy and how we are prepared to put ourselves forward. And so it is sort of connected to all of that. All of that. There's been a lot of discussion about, I mean, Sacha mentioned the ISSB and you mentioned, Sarah, the TCFD and the work of the FSB and the G20. It's like alphabet soup, isn't it?
It is.
I just want to say, from being on the TCFD from ground zero, how important the experience of that, because that's similar to the TPT, it seemed like a bit of an unsurmountable challenge to give a sort of umbrella framework that was going to be usable. And I look back on it and think, wow, it really was much more successful in its goals than, frankly, anybody who sat around that table back in 2016 really imagined. And I've been trying to think about what were the things that were important around it. And it's very similar to what we've talked about with the TPT, very similar to what Sacha said around try and be as standardized and comparable as possible, but recognize that there is a certain degree of sector specificity that makes comparability much more relevant. If you try and compare a Unilever to an energy company, then you're into all sorts of issues of where our footprint sits. Try and keep things focused on mitigation and don't get pulled too much into adaptation. And finally, be realistic about what it is possible for companies in the real economy who sit at the preparer layer, because everything hinges on what preparers can actually provide. Things like providing a climate set of financials will show me what the cost of this would be had you chosen not to operate your business in a responsible way. That's impossible. I mean, I'm kind of Scottish accountant, and I have to sign up for the numbers that we produce and bring to all of our stakeholders. And I will tell you if it's not possible. And we are all trying, those of us in this space, to tell everybody what's possible and what's not possible, and things like separating the cost of climate investment around the transition. I can understand why people would want it, but we just simply can't provide that information. So
goes back to your point about it's integrated, right?
Exactly.
It's part of how you're
if
trying
somebody
to
says,
run
well,
the business.
can you tell me how that factory would perform if you chose to put a non-biomass boiler in?
Yeah.
Well, we just don't choose to put a non-biomass boiler in, so I can't tell you.
If I might add one thing on the TCFD, and this reflects our own experience of having done TCFD disclosures. The first was a bit ropey, the second got better, and the third we thought was pretty great. And I think that is to encourage you to roll your sleeves up and have a go on transition plans. You'll look back and you'll be embarrassed at the first version that you did, but it's better to start and have a go, and we'll all get better quicker.
Exactly right.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll just add, because Graeme's raised it, that the TPT will also be looking at specific sectoral guidance this year as well. So you'll see more from TPT in coming months on that. Tanya, a quick question for you. Today, the TPT announced sort of new domestic regulators being appointed to the delivery group as observers. And it would be great to hear from you, why you think it's important to have transition plans, across a range of different regulated entities, and to have different regulators with different mandates all looking at transition plans.
No, I mean, absolutely essential in terms of, we all dread the word greenwash. And, I know we joke about you wouldn't take to a recruitment fair a transition plan necessarily, but we know there's this anxiety in terms of actually what is being set out and what is underway. I think there's no doubt that certainly as an organisation we would very much like to see this, the transition plans to be on a mandatory basis, not just for listed companies but actually for all large companies, because this is about a level playing field and this is about a whole economy transition. This isn't ultimately about a penalisation process, it's an enablement process. So I think the more that we have the appropriate regulators both in the room, either very involved in terms of the detail of the work, but actually understanding what's coming, I think is absolutely essential to its rollout moving forward.
Great, thank you. And for Sacha, at the moment, your focus is on updating the rules for listed companies, but how can the TPT's recommendations be rolled out more widely across all asset classes and other jurisdictions? A few weeks ago, the FCA published a stewardship consultation paper. Sort of what recommendations would you give to companies on macro stewardship?
Well, first of all, just like TCFD, we did take our time. We gave companies, but we were the first country in the world to go mandatory, but then we gave large companies first, then small companies, and asset managers and asset owners, because they've got to do the same thing. We're in the sandbox, and we're co-leading it. We're going to put a transition plan, because one thing I don't like is people telling other people to do things and not do it themselves. So we're going to do it, and it's hard. And it's definitely hard when you're in a different shape and stuff, and I'm sure that will be a good area to look at. But the most important thing is that we say, hang on, if you are an asset owner and it's a net zero asset owner alliance, well, you're never going to get there unless you get the asset managers to do their bit. So it's all good making the corporates do things all the time and coming up with new acronyms and alphabet soup and telling them to do things. Everyone has to do their bit, and therefore we are looking at all the people that finance. There is a lot of insurance, all of these areas that can be involved in this, and also internationally. So I think it's about making sure it's fair, comparable, and using the tools in the toolkit. But it's very easy to talk to an asset owner and say, how are you going to get to your net zero commitment? Now, we might not be the regulator of them, but we can definitely make sure that we're sure. And they don't only own equities. In fact, some of them don't own many equities, so it has to be in other asset classes. And private equity is another area that we've been working very hard at the TPT to try and get inclusive. Because just think about it, when you talk to private equity, at some point they want an exit. And that exit may be to a public vehicle. And therefore we need that information to sell it to a public vehicle. So why don't you produce it now so that it's more valuable? So we're trying to sell it that way as well. So very important.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to go around one more time, but this time I'm going to ask you all the same question. So if you had maybe one, or if you really can't bear one, you can do up to 3, but they have to be brief. Pieces of advice for companies preparing a transition plan today to make it a real success. Sort of what would those be? And Sarah, to start with you.
So my first is be brave, kind of roll your sleeves up, just start, it'll get better over time. That's what happened with the work that we did on scenario analysis, the work that everybody's done on disclosures. Recognize it's not easy, but starting is the best thing you can do. Don't let perfection get in the way of progress, please. Second thing, ask for help and collaborate. There's loads of stuff out there. Toolkits are available, engaging in the sandbox. All of that kind of is there for the taking. So my second piece of advice is copy. Third, recognize there'll be upside here. This is not all downside, quite the reverse. There'll be benefits in terms of engagement with your suppliers, in terms of those that finance you, in terms of engaging with your staff. It is not just a chore, quite the reverse. It's a real opportunity to turn a risk into something good. So 3 things: be brave, ask for help and copy, and recognize the upside.
Very similar, to be honest. Obviously, get started. It's not going to go away, so get on it. I think be prepared to have some fun with it. It's a tremendous way of engaging parts of your organization that might not be obvious. You can really bring lots and lots of parts of your business together. To your point, Tanya, that the ability to leverage your supplier ecosystem is massive. There's huge leverage available to you if you extend out into your wider ecosystem and become a little bit, I would say dictatorial, but let them know the standards that you expect. You can have a tremendous leverage benefit from that. And I think the final thing is, just be prepared to talk to your peers. This is generally a very pre-competitive thing. And certainly the experience we've had, you can pick up the phone and talk to other. It's a great area, actually, if you might be unable to talk to peer companies for other competitive reasons. This is pre-competitive, and you can talk and share. That's where that sectoral momentum comes from, and that it ultimately gives really usable information to the market, because as Sacha said, investors, asset owners want to be able to make comparison across the narrow points of a sector, and if everybody moves in lockstep, it's much easier for the market to do that.
All right, thank you.
I couldn't agree more with Sarah and Graeme's analysis. I think I would add 2 things, or build on one and add another. In terms of being bold and ambitious, reach for the stars and you might hit the moon. This is a really tremendous opportunity to sort of shake up, examine, consider the business, and an opportunity as part of that transition. I guess the second one sits a bit more personally. People often say, gosh, Tanya, you had an early sector, private sector career. I was certainly a lot younger and a lot fitter in those days. And isn't it great to go and do purposeful work now? And it is, but wow, what we're talking about tonight is purposeful work. This is an incredible, in Amanda's words, personal legacy for you to help a real economy transition to safeguard the planet for future generations. Now, I know that sounds awfully grand, but that is the truth of it in terms of businesses, financial institutions. You are the absolute lifeblood of the economy and our natural resources. So this, for me, is incredible purposeful work, and I do think the opportunity sits in the room here.
How do you go after all of those things? Are there any lawyers in the room? Well, that's my piece of advice. When the lawyer says you can't collaborate, tell them either to come to us or come to the CMA and others that have already said that you can. We have to systemic. This is very important. We will give you safe harbour because this is really important. You're pre-competitive, because many lawyers say all the time, we keep hearing that, you can't do that. you can. And you need to because others are going to do it. So I think that's one piece of advice, and I think that's really important. And then as an investor, always going to be an investor at heart, sell this transition plan. Why? Because if you start doing this, you're going to find out that you're spending a hell of a lot of money sometime down the road in the wrong areas. And by doing this, you're going to find that out quicker than if you don't do it. And then you can reallocate, pivot, and all of those wonderful technical terms people use when they've made a mistake. Pivot, I love that word. And then you can then go in the right direction. And that's what we're going to have to do because everyone's going to make mistakes. So go for it. And that's why I think it will help investors make capital allocation decisions.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And, I'd like to thank all of the panelists for the insights they've given us. I mean, just to round up some of the remarks that have been made, I think, one of the key messages that's come across from the discussion tonight is to get started, to be bold, and not to worry about everything being perfect the first time, and to look at what peers are doing, to collaborate with peers and to share with peers. And you have heard it from the regulator's mouth tonight that this is pre-regulatory and that this should not be a risky activity. And if in doubt, talk to your friendly regulator. Also, we've heard a lot tonight about the upside, and I was very pleased to hear that. It's often forgotten that, when we're looking at TCFD, or I'm sure also TNFD, we're talking about risks and opportunities, and it's so important to remember those opportunities, and that transition plans fundamentally, as an activity within the organisation and as a type of disclosure are forward-looking. They're about what your business will be in the future, the opportunities that you're finding and building. We've also heard about the importance for nature, or for the climate transition of nature, and how to begin to think about that, and we do expect to see more work coming through on that. I think this is an agenda that will shape more over time, but an early area to look at was flagged as being particularly around supply chains and, for example, the deforestation impacts in supply chains. And we've also heard about the role of the financial sector in this in terms of governance of transition plans and macro stewardship and how they use them to make decisions, and about how those transition plans will also be used and be decision useful for the regulators themselves in their macro stewardship role. So I think that's been a really rounded exploration. I'd like to thank the panel once again and draw this to a close. And so then I have the pleasure of handing over to Julie Baddeley and Rachel McEwen, who will be coming on stage next.
Thanks, Kate.